Welcome back, everyone, to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker, and today I'm going to do a painting from a recent trip up to Gloucester, Massachusetts, to the Marine Railway Shipyard, which is a place on Rocky Neck, one of the oldest artist colonies in the United States. And this place is where they restore old ships, rebuild old ships, where people come to work on their boats over the weekend. And that's what was our subject. A couple weeks ago, we were up there and painting from scenes like this. And in the course of this painting, I'm going to talk a little bit about using graded washes and how they're effective to describe the movement of light throughout the scene, create interest and variety in our washes, and give us a feeling of luminosity as well. With a watercolor, we're working wet on wet, especially in the beginning here, and you see me start with the yellow ochre. And while that yellow ochre is wet, while this wash is wet, I'll do one of several things. I might add water to lighten it. In this case, I'm adding some cobalt blue to give us a little change in the wash, a very gradual change, because it's done at an angle, and you see how the blue is drifting down and coming over the top of the yellow ochre, giving us a really soft transition, which is evoking a feeling of light in the sky to the right, the western sky, and as it moves to the left, we're getting just a little more of a bluish feel. So we get this, the result is we get a feeling of light change in the sky. And it's as it dries, you'll see it gets even more subtle, but even in this subtle state, it can convey movement of light or change in light. And this gives to our painting a feeling of luminosity, a feeling of change and interest. If we painted the sky, a flat blue, it could be a good backdrop, but just this subtle change, moving from a little cooler aspect to a warmer aspect on the horizon, evokes more of a transitory time of day, a feeling of light moving across the sky, and takes advantage of some of watercolor's properties. You'll notice that the color blended practically by itself. By tilting the board, gravity pulls the color down and allows the two different tonalities or two different colors to blend. And you can see I've done that in the lower section. I've done it going from a bit paler burnt sienna, light burnt sienna with a little blue, to a darker, richer application in the lower part. So we're getting a feeling of light moving across the surface. And this will be more effective once we place some of the shadow work on top of this surface, once we place a feeling of division in the boards, and so on. Once we add these detail parts, this lower wash, this beginning wash, really gets activated, and its purpose becomes more profound. So these early washes are quite important. And like I said, we're working with the media wet onto wet, which is not the easiest way to work with watercolor, because you're depending on some things beyond your control. You're depending on gravity, on pulling the color down. You're depending on it drying at a certain rate. You're depending on your sense of how dark the pigment is, how diluted the pigment is. These are things we train ourselves in as we're painting with watercolor. Over the years, we train ourselves to understand these qualities, but to use them effectively, they almost need to be intuitive, because it happens so quickly. Graded washes. So after this wash dries off, I can return to the dry paper and start to create the backdrop of trees, distant trees across the water, feeling of the structure in the boat, this rig which hoists boats out of the water and pulls them across the dry dock so that the workers can work on the underside, whether it's to clean them, repair them, paint them, retouch the paint as the man was doing today. Well, I don't know the proper name for it, but it's a very imposing structure, very imposing machine, and they can hoist enormous boats out of the water using this and effectively work on the underside. So this is one of the striking qualities of this location, is the scale on which these workers repair boats, restore boats, and all of that is great subject matter for the visual artist, for the painter, and they seem not to mind. We're there on a Sunday, which is an off day for them, but when we're in the busy work days, if we hang around the edges and sketch, they don't seem to mind. They seem to expect artists to be in the area. In fact, if you walk down Rocky Neck beyond the railroad marina, you see various artist studios. You see a lot of painters working outdoors and in their studios. So these two aspects of culture, the artist and the carpenters and restorers of boats, they seem to work side by side, and have worked side by side for quite a while in the town of Gloucester. It's a unique community that supports these sorts of activities. So we feel welcome, and we feel we've got a great subject matter in front of us. I'm working with dry technique now, building up the lift. I'll call it the lift because its purpose is to lift boats so that they can work on the underside. I'm working on the lift with ultramarine blue and a little bit of neutral tint to tone it down, trying to create this structure in an abbreviated fashion, certainly not painting all the detail, but trying to get, especially in these vertical members, trying to get a feeling of strength and big scale with the brush strokes. I'm trying to create a feeling of also animation with my brush strokes, so they taper, while the sides of the structure are perfectly straight. My strokes tend to taper, and this tapering in the stroke, wide at one end, narrowing and then wide at the other, gives a feeling of stability, also a feeling of sort of calligraphy, the power of the brush strokes, let's call it that. And I keep using this method to create the structure. And as I'm moving along, I notice opportunities to show the light on the scene, whether it's a piece of the machine that's catching the light directly. I'll leave a little bright spot, later on putting an accent behind it. Tapering the graded wash. Look, in this the stroke that I'm working on now is one of the forward pillars of the lift, and as I work it, I'm keeping it wet so that I can either add water or more color to it. In this case, I'm going to be adding a little darker hue up at the top, and as it comes down, keeping a lighter aspect. This, in essence, creates a feeling of luminosity, of light bouncing back up into the subject, light bounce. And it's a common phenomena when we're working outside to see light bouncing from the ground, especially in this case where you have a rather bright material underneath. The boards that are underneath the boat and the structure are weathered and light in color, and they're bouncing light back up into things like this. So I develop a graded wash in these elements too, in the boat, in the shadows, in the figure. All these elements, I'm aware of how to develop the large wash. Now you see me building the wash that describes the boat, a really important shape, so I'm moving slowly to achieve this shape. But as I'm building the shape, I'm aware of a darkness on the top and some luminosity through the bottom of the boat, and then as it reaches the blocks the boat rests on, again getting darker, and that darkness extends itself into a shadow. So even though this is one wash, and it's an important wash because it's kind of grounding our main subject, um, it's changing over the course of the wash. So we're dropping color, and while this color is wet, we're either adding a secondary color, or we're adding water, or in some cases we're adding very dark paint and allowing it to kind of spread out into the wash. Basically, another graded wash, going from a darker aspect to a lighter aspect, creating the effect of light bouncing back up into the subject. So this tutorial, this sequence is really about graded washes. You've heard me in previous videos and seen me demonstrate graded washes, so you know that I like them and I look for opportunities to use them, because I feel that they impart on the subject a feeling of the natural light and give us an opportunity to manipulate that light for effect. And quite honestly, they can change a rather flat wash into something much more dynamic and enjoyable to look at. Sometimes we grade the wash from light to dark, going from a darker aspect to a lighter aspect, or vice versa. Sometimes we go from one color to another color. This is particularly effective when you're countering warm colors against cool colors. You can create a dynamic wash doing that as well. So look at how this, as we're developing the boat and its shadow, quite a beautiful shape, just from a point of view of shape. And as the pigment dries, you'll see more of a change in that wash develop. As it dries, the color with more water in it will lighten, whereas the color with the part with richer color will remain pretty much the same. Even in these brush strokes that we're adding now, where the stroke comes off of the main wheel, I'm adding a little extra color, in this case more ultramarine blue and a little bit of neutral tint. I'm adding more color to the base of that shadow. As I pull the shadow down or to the left, naturally the color is going to lighten, and the result is you get a feeling of transparency in the shadows. As it moves across this color of the boards, the underpainting will come through more in areas that have a little lighter aspect to it, and the color will disappear a little more where it's rather dark near the wheels. As it looks now in the video, it looks pretty uniform, but when you see the final version where it's had a chance to dry, you'll notice that aspect. And this is all done sort of, I would say, as much by instinct and feel as it is by observation. Especially with these darker hues, it can be tricky to evaluate how they're going to dry, so I pay a lot of attention on the consistency of the paint, and have a little faith that it's going to dry light or dark as I anticipate it might. This sort of feel is built up through experience. There's really no other way. It's not like an instructor can say, well, you need to get this dark, you need 30 cc's of water and 5 cc's of ultramarine blue, and we have no concept of what that measurement is when we're mixing paint, and we certainly don't want to be distracted by that too much while we're painting. So it's done by feel and with an anticipation of what's going to happen. You can see how we're connecting the darks across the painting via shadows, creating an interesting pattern of brushwork over the floorboards, and now working into those floorboards with a darker hue. This darker hue is meant to not only describe the direction and width of the boards that make up the structure, but also meant to make these dark blue marks feel a little more transparent. As the dark mark runs through the shadow and dries, we'll feel that this shadow is transparent, and we can see the dark shadow aspects of the gaps in the boards through the blue shadow. Well, all through the painting, I've tried to maintain a sort of calligraphic feel to it, and I'm pleased with that. I see, as I do with every painting, I see the inaccuracies, and I guess they don't bother me as much as they used to. I don't mind being inaccurate in places, as long as I kind of achieve strength in the brushwork. I feel that I've been successful if I can convey a strength in the brushwork and at the same time portray my subject. Of course, there's trade-offs. We sometimes sacrifice accuracy for a beautiful wash. What I'm doing now is adjusting. These shadows are not in my subject, but I felt that the lower left corner to be too busy, and so I'm just painting extra shadows. Do they make sense? They do. We don't question that they're there. They weren't there. If you look at the source photo up above, you see that it was largely floorboards down there. But I'm unifying this dark to, again, draw the eye towards the figure that's painting the boat and make the lower section just a little less busy. It's always a danger when you're enjoying yourself with the brush to make a section perhaps more busy than it should be. In this case, I'm trying to rectify that by joining a lot of the shadows so that they feel more like a solid mass, or like a group of shadows, let's say, as opposed to too many broken shadows. And still keep it visually interesting, and still keep my main subject as the main draw. So we're developing the painting. It's moving towards the final stages. We're putting in some of the rigging above the boat, adding some highlights and details to the subject, painting some wires and more stirrups in the lift. There's all kinds of things that we could add. If you look at the subject, it's almost irresistible to paint all the little buttons and wires and tubes and doodads that come off. But that can that can also lead to a distraction, and I feel if I'm doing that too much, my inner voice says, step back, have a look. Do we need that? Is it helping? Is it distracting? Trying to keep some objective perspective on the whole process so that I give enough information and don't give too much. Yeah, now I feel like I'm starting to cross the line, maybe adding a little too much, so I'll probably end up blurring some of this stuff in the final image. We'll see how it dries. But overall, the painting is coming out pretty well according to plan. We've described the light of the day, we've described the boat and the lift pretty well. The shadow play has really taken a major role in making the image, and the play of brushwork, brushstrokes, is something I'm trying to celebrate in this painting, and I feel that's coming out. Perhaps we could have varied. Well, we won't talk about what could be done differently at this point. We'll just keep painting, and there's a time for examination. That's when we're away from our subject, having a beer, able to look at our subject with some objectivity. It's kind of dangerous to be too critical when you're in the middle of the painting, or certainly with the brush in your hand. Here's the finished piece. You can see how those shadows have a transparency to them now, largely because of those dark lines that are creating the wooden flooring that's underneath everything. The graded washes, you can see them with more clarity now after it's dried. You can see the darks, how they make the light bounce back up into the lift or the boat or the sky or the boards. So this was primarily an exercise in creating graded washes with maybe some ideas on using brush strokes. Anyway, if you look in the description of this video, you can see a link to my materials list and also some reasons for doing the painting. I try to include my goal in creating the painting in the description, so you can see more information there. Thank you.